Well, good evening. Welcome on this Sunday, the 4th of October. If you're watching us live on Sunday evening, or perhaps you're watching later on catch up on YouTube, however you're watching, it's really good to have you with us. My name is David. I'm one of the people on the staff team at Christ Church in Cambridge, and we're a church family in the city of Cambridge, wanting to trust Jesus. We believe and trust in Jesus and think he is the greatest news for the world. We want to trust Jesus, love others, and share something of the hope we have. And welcome to this. This is the latest of our series of online events that we've been running like this, where we think about some issues really that affect us all and how the Christian faith tackles them, tackling life. And then we open it up to questions. You might have been with us a little while back in the summer, when we had Debbie Flood, the former Olympic rower, talking about her experience as an elite athlete and her Christian faith and some of her experiences with that. You might have been around for that one. Tonight, we're really pleased to have Tamar Pollard with us as we think about this question. We're going to think about this question tonight. Is forgiveness possible? In a moment, I'm going to bring Tamar on. We'll get to meet her, hear a little bit about her as we start our conversation. And we think about this subject around forgiveness. And then once that's over, we'll have a brief pause, and then it will be time for any of your questions. Tamar very kindly said she's willing to have your questions asked and think about answering them as best she can. So really willing to do that. That'll be a good thing as well. If you have questions that you'd like to ask, there's two ways that you can submit those to us. The first one, you can use YouTube Live. You'll be watching on YouTube at the moment. You can use YouTube live chats. So you can pop them on there, and we'll look out for them and make sure they're added to the list. The other way, and the better way, really, is to use something called Pigeonhole Live. That's probably the best way. So if you've got a laptop or a phone or a tablet nearby, if you head over to the Pigeonhole Live website, and where it says something like joining an event, if you type in forgive, that's the little password for this event tonight. If you type in forgive, that will take you through to the forum where you can pop in questions. You can do that throughout the evening. And maybe there'll be something that you hear in my conversation with Tamar in a little while that sparks a question. Pop it on there. Or maybe you've got questions already, even from the title, you can pop them on there. The other thing you can do is, well, maybe somebody else, if you keep having a look at that, you'll see the other questions that people have put on to be asked, and it might be you think, do you know what, that is the question I would love to hear an answer to. And instead of just asking it again, you can click on to vote for that, and that'll let us know there's a few people who would like that question to be asked as well. I think there's been a few people who have joined us since we've begun. So let me say again, if you've just joined us since we started, really great to have you here with us. My name's David, and welcome. This is an online event run by Christ Church in Cambridge, tackling life. We're thinking tonight about this question: is forgiveness really possible? I don't know what you think about that. And with us tonight, we've got Tamar Pollard, who's going to be joining us and speaking to that. In fact, I am going to get Tamar to join us now. I think she should be able to pop up on the screen. Tamar, are you there?
I am. Hello.
Tamar, it's great. It's great to have you with us. Thank you very much for being willing to do this and have a conversation around this topic of forgiveness. I know you a little bit, and most people watching, I guess, won't know you at all. Can you tell us, we'll maybe detect an accent a little bit as you speak. Tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from.
Yeah, so I'm Yorkshire born and Yorkshire bred. The rest of the phrase goes strong in arm and thick in head. So I grew up in West Yorkshire, was brought up by a Kiwi mum and a Yorkshire dad with an older sister and a younger brother. But I'm now based in Bedford, as the director for families, children's and youth ministry in a church there.
All right, great. So Yorkshire mum, Kiwi dad, you're a sports fan?
Absolutely, yeah. So cricket's my number one passion. But love rugby league, rugby union, football, anything really. Horse racing, not so bothered about, but yeah, most other things I can get excited for.
Oh, okay. So we've sidelined all the horse racing fans who are watching tonight. But everyone else, rugby and other things, that's fine. Yeah. And Kiwi mum, British dad. So where do the loyalties lie in terms of who you support?
Well, it depends which sport it is, and that always makes me sound a bit of a glory supporter. So mum was all about rugby union, and I would have been evicted from our house if I hadn't have supported the All Blacks first. So rugby union, them first, England against anyone else. But it's reversed when it comes to cricket. So the World Cup last year, I was cheering on England and feeling a little bit guilty, but not too much.
Okay, so in lots of ways, you can have your cake and eat it when it comes to those kind of things.
Say that, yeah.
Yeah. Now, Tamar, just for people who are watching, they might have seen the little trailer we gave to this and realize some of the things we're going to be talking about later on, they're sad and upsetting. And just to flag up, you've given me permission to ask the questions about those things, so they're not being landed on you just out of the blue. We've spoken a little bit about that before, so thank you very much for that. Before we get into something of your story, just as we think about, we're going to think about this question: is forgiveness possible? And it's how to put this? It's probably good to give some kind of broad definition of what we're talking about here. Not that we're giving a cast iron definition of everything, but for someone who might think, look, what we're going to be getting at, just saying forgiveness means that deciding something that happened doesn't matter, really. So forgiveness is really just getting a perspective on something, and it's really just saying that thing that happened, I'm just going to act like it didn't matter at all, and that's what we mean by forgiveness. If you hear that, what comes to mind when you're talking about forgiveness?
Yeah, I think that's often a thought, isn't it? That phrase, forgive and forget. But I think forgiveness isn't about forgetting, and it's not about pain ending, and nor is it about not caring about justice. So it isn't any of those things. I think actually, when we look at the most amazing act of forgiveness, when the forgiveness God offers us, we see it's about a free gift, undeserved. It's about a debt being cancelled. So if someone's wronged us, rather than holding on to it and holding it over them, it's choosing to say, I want to do good to you. I want to show kindness, undeserved kindness to you, modeling what has been shown to us.
Thank you. Well, I think that's helpful, because and we'll maybe get some questions on that as well. Obviously, you're speaking as a Christian tonight, and I think we'll hear as we go through some of what you're going to tell us that for a Christian, that motivation, as you've just talked about there, for that kind of forgiveness is grounded in the message of Jesus Christ. Tamar, the context, I guess the context for what you're going to share about forgiveness is part of the story of your family. It's not everything, but it's certainly a significant part of the story of your family, and particularly your parents. You've mentioned Kiwi, Yorkshireman. Tell us a little bit more about your parents.
Yeah, so as I said, mum and dad were both teachers, and that's where they actually met. Mum came over on a working holiday from New Zealand, inspired by Enid Blyton. She thought England was all cobbled streets and thatched cottages.
Wow. Enid Blyton.
How wrong was she? Anyway, they met teaching in a school, and slowly things developed. She had returned to New Zealand, but then came back. And it was while they were on a youth hosteling trip, actually, with a number of colleagues. They were in Prague in 1968. And they awoke one morning to the news that the Russians had invaded. It was a time known as Pridespring, where people were pushing against sort of the oppression of communist regime. And Mum and Dad were there, and being the adventurers they were kind of told to stay in the youth hostel, but they didn't. And they went out and they explored, and they saw tanks rolling in and flags burning, and soldiers attacking crowds. And they were there for about 36 hours before they were evacuated, but obviously saw and heard things that they would have never experienced either in New Zealand or Yorkshire. And that's really the start of their Eastern Europe story. Dad at the time was reading something in the Bible. Both my parents were Christians at this stage. And Dad was reading a bit from the end of the Bible, from a book called 1 John. And I'll paraphrase, it kind of talks about if we say we know God's love, but we don't show love to others, how does that match up? Out of compassion, if we don't love others. My dad kept thinking, well, I've experienced God's love and I've seen these people in need. How do I put love into action with these people in what was Czechoslovakia, but also wider in Eastern Europe? How do I put that love into action? And he couldn't get me. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so your mum and dad, young married couple. Is that right? They were married at that time, and
about.
And that. So 1968, Pridespring. I think it's part of some schools' GCSE course. So it might be even some younger people watching who think, oh, we've heard about that. Those who are older might be aware of it as well. And so that's quite a dramatic experience to have, to wake up kind of on that trip, tanks in, and then thinking it through as a Christian. I mean, I can imagine lots of people might go from thinking, wow, that's quite an experience. Maybe I should do something, but not knowing what to do. So what was the next step for them?
Well, a few weeks later, they met a Dutchman called Andrew, and they were chatting to him about what they had seen. And Andrew was already going into different countries behind the Iron Curtain, taking in Bibles and other aid. And he just said to my mum and dad, look, you're both teachers. You have ridiculously long holidays, which I used to be a teacher, so I feel I can agree with that statement. And he said, why don't you use your holidays to go and help people? If you feel challenged by it, why don't you use that? And so that's what they decided to do. So every summer holiday and some Christmas and Easters as well, they would pack up. Started with a car, but as us kids came along, it grew to a camper van. And they would take food and medicine and clothes and Bibles into Eastern Europe. So
that's one thing, isn't it? You can imagine when you're young and you're married and you feel fewer responsibilities. We can just jump in the car. It feels a bit risky, but we'll go and do it. But as you and your siblings came on, they just kept doing that. And that's a very different. So that I guess that means you and your siblings had a very different kind of summer experience to your friends at school. When you're saying what you're doing over the summer. So tell us some of the things you would have been up to.
So as soon as school broke up, we'd load up and then we'd head off. We'd drive for 48 hours solid to get through Western Europe as quickly as we could. And then we would go a day or two to a place and move on. It was, as I say, delivering things. It varied from place to place what it was like in that. For example, Bulgaria, we weren't allowed to speak in the street because we would draw attention to ourselves as Westerners, and that could lead to people getting into trouble. In some countries, like East Germany, Yugoslavia, as it was, you had to stay in state campsites with soldiers with machine guns guarding in and out. And so it wasn't normal, but that was my summer holiday. My summer holiday was outside toilets and concrete blocks and limited food choices, hot weather. It was, being scared to speak, and but at the same time, was all I was used to. So it's funny, although it was unusual, I didn't know any different.
Yeah, and looking back on it, I mean, it's easy. All sorts of things that sound exciting when you hear about it. For those of us maybe on the outside of it, there can be a kind of romantic image of what it was like. Yeah. Was it enjoyable? How did you feel?
No, I really didn't enjoy it. So it was 6 weeks in a cramped camper van. I had shared bed with my sister. It was hot. There was no one else to play with other than my siblings. I was jealousy. My friends used to go on package holidays to Spain and France. I didn't know what actually they were, but I knew they could bring sweets for everyone in my class, and I couldn't. So I really didn't enjoy it. I didn't enjoy the food. I didn't enjoy the fact people called me Tamara instead of Tamar. Little things, but when you're a child, all those things get to you. So although there were elements that were fun and I loved boasting about the different countries, how many countries I'd been to each year. I think probably until I was about 13, I was quite resentful of it all.
Yeah. Okay. And we talked a little bit about this. I guess some of us and people watching might be beginning to have a picture of what summer looked like for you, your siblings, and your mum and dad. But there was some there's some things that we perhaps wouldn't imagine. You've told me about some of the stories. You encountered some quite extraordinary things during those trips. I mean, you've mentioned a couple of them to me. People coming to look for people on your bus that you were on, being stopped at borders and being searched. Just give us a flavour of some of those things.
Yeah, so the one where we were stopped, a friend in what is now Kosovo needed medical attention. He was a pastor of a church and had been refused to go to hospital because of his vocation. And so mum and dad decided that actually he needed to go and we would transport him there. And we took him and his wife and his 4 kids all crammed in the back of a camper van with us. But we were stopped by police as we travelled to the hospital, and they asked to see our passports. This wasn't unusual. Often Westerners were stopped because not many Westerners were around, and it was a way of getting a bit of quick cash. And so they took the passports and they checked us off one by one, and my dad, my mum, my sister, and so on. But they walked past the minister and they didn't see him, and they walked past his wife and they didn't see her, and they walked past their 4 kids and they didn't see them. I remember my mum's hand being on my knee almost to shut me up at that point, because I was kind of, what is going on? Why are they not? And I guess we read about in the Bible Jesus making blind eyes see. And mum and dad just explained it to us afterwards. Well, in that moment, God made seeing eyes blind. He stopped them from seeing. So that was one. That's
fascinating to you. Now, we live in a kind of cynical and skeptical age, don't we? And if you want to dismiss things, but I've had people say to me things like, "Oh, I believe in God. If only He did something that gave some kind of evidence, if you like." And that for you watching that, it just help us. It was as dramatic as that. It was fairly clear this would be someone they were looking for, and they just walked past them.
Yeah. And so the only explanation, I was 7 at the time, was, well, God's done that. I don't know how. But somehow the stuff, it helped me sort of begin to go, oh, yeah, God isn't just in charge of the universe, but He's interested in the details in our individual lives. And that was similar with the gunpoint story when my mum was arrested, when they found Bibles on the Romanian border, and they kept her hostage, and they marched me and my dad and brother and sister back to Hungary with guns at our back.
How old were you at this point?
I was 8. And for me, that's an Enid Blyton thing as well, because I was like, oh, this is like a famous 5 adventure, as I had a Kalashnikov at my back. Bit misguided. But I guess, again, it was my parents weren't panicking. They weren't worrying. It must have been awful for my dad to leave my mum and the camper van. Well, my mum, not the camper van, but
so
leave her.
I'm not sure you explained that. So they kept your mum?
Yes, they found Bibles on the border as we tried to get into Romania, and they said we had to pay a fine of over £3,500. This is 1985, so it'd be a 5-figure number equivalent, I guess, now. And we didn't have the money, and so they decided to keep mum hostage and the camper van hostage until we could get the money to set her free. And so we were marched back. And then Dad spent the next.
Sorry, and you were marched over the border into another country.
Yeah, we walked for about 2 hours, sort of through no man's land, back to the nearest town, and then we were left to go. And we got a bus to the nearest friends we had in Hungary, who lived in a little village. And then Dad spent the next 2 days at the post office, because that was the only place with a phone, trying to ring through to the bank. It was a weekend, trying to arrange a loan for this money. And remarkably, as they called an emergency staff meeting on the Saturday in this local branch, just a little market town, and my dad taught 3 of the staff's children, and so they said they would act as guarantors for the loan, and the money was wired very quickly. But mum and dad, as we got mum back and we continued on our way, we didn't turn home. We weren't allowed into Romania, but we just went to other countries instead. And they talked to us about not telling people how much we had borrowed, how much we had had to pay. Because they said to us, look, God promises to provide for us. He promises to take care of our needs. So people knew we'd been in trouble. People knew mum had been hostage, but no one knew the amount. And they said, God will take care of this loan. I don't think we really understood what a loan was, but we saw their confidence again, that God was in charge. And sure enough, by just anonymous gifts and donations that would just come through the letterbox when we're eating tea, or through the post when we're at school, 6 months to the date after the fine had been paid, the loan had been paid off. And so I think I just, again and again, whilst I didn't enjoy my trips in the summer, again and again, I sort of built my own faith that God is real and at work.
Yeah, thank you for telling that story again. I remember when you first mentioned it to me, it shows you the way my mind works. I was almost imagining when you said that your parents didn't want you to talk about it, because there was a sense they we're a bit embarrassed about how foolish we were, but it wasn't that. They were trusting God, and it was, we don't want to look as if we're asking people for money. Because we think, because we're trusting God to help us and provide for us. I mean, again, that's quite a picture of your parents for us to have. And for you just touched on it. It's building up something for you. If you can just briefly tell us about yourself becoming a Christian, how you would think about that experience over that time.
Yeah, so mum and dad took us to church right from the get-go, and prayed with us at home and read the Bible to us, and talked very naturally about God in the everyday life. And so I think I always knew something of who Jesus is. But it was when I was 6, so a couple of years before that, I'd been at an event, and I just remember going home, and I was on the bottom bunk bed, and just grasping for the first time that really, although mum and dad had asked God to forgive them for the wrong things they'd done, and sort of realised that Jesus had died to take their punishment, I hadn't done that myself. And so at the age of 6, it was very simple understanding, but it was kind of, I knew I'd done wrong. I knew I deserved to be punished. I had plenty of punishments at home and at school. And I knew I deserved to be punished by God, but I knew Jesus had done something about that. And so I talked with God and asked him to forgive me and for Jesus to be my saviour and friend. And so that was when I was 6. And then consecutive summers, these building blocks sort of develop, don't they? And so it sort of grounds what you believe. Yeah,
and one of the things, just hearing some of your story, I think I was interested in. I mean, you've experienced a lot. You've experienced quite a lot, and I guess Christian faith is maybe always has, but particularly for you, there's a bit of an edge to it. I mean, to say that some of the experiences that your family had were edgy is possibly an understatement. Being held up at gunpoint, mum being taken hostage, but kind of getting through it. And did all that kind of ever leave you with a feeling? Look, the Christian life is a bit edgy. We do things that are a bit risky, but generally God's good and things will work out. It'll all work out. We'll be okay. The money will come through. Mum will come back. That's the way God works.
I think I had seen again and again the way that God took care of us. It wasn't always the way we wanted it. And I had a brother who died as a baby, so I knew that it didn't always work out in the way we would choose. But there was certainly, and we had friends in Eastern Europe in prison, so it wasn't by trusting God everything will be fine. But there was a confidence that He was good and He was loving and He would help us through the difficult times.
Okay, that's helpful. I mean, there's, and I imagine if we had more time, you could tell us, about other things that happened. But Tamar, let me ask you now, because you and your parents went through all sorts of different things. You and your siblings are growing up, off to uni to study and various things, and your parents were still going on their trips, weren't they? Is that without you now? Is that the way they carried on?
Yeah, so obviously sort of 1989, 1990, 91 was quite pivotal in the politics of Eastern Europe. Communist regimes fell from place to place, but there was still immense poverty. There was still a lack of resources within churches and outside of that. And so mum and dad kept on going. And as long as we put our summers to good use, once we hit sixth form, we didn't have to go, but they did feel they should.
Okay, they were still going in the camper van, loading it up, heading off to various places. So, like, Tamar, tell us about your dad's final trip, if you would.
Yeah. So mum and dad had been away for about 10 days, and they were traveling sort of further and further east. So they'd gone through Slovakia, and they were traveling, cutting through sort of northeast Hungary to go on to Romania, Moldova and Ukraine. And it was as they traveled through Hungary, one night, the camper van lights failed. That wasn't unusual. We were always having breakdowns. But the problem is the roads were unlit and not well surfaced. And so it wasn't safe to keep driving. And so mum and dad thought what they'd do is they'd just pull in, park in a lay-by. They weren't in any rush to get over the border. They'd had hoped to cross that night because it's quieter at night. But we're just like, we'll just sleep in this lay-by. And in the morning, we'll go to the nearest town, get the lights fixed and continue on our way. Yeah. And that was like all our trips. They were really fluid, our plans. But as they stopped in a lay-by, some local youths must have noticed the Western vehicle. And again, I think just thought, here's a way of earning a bit of cash. And so they knocked on the door and spoke in Hungarian to my parents and pretended to be policemen, was saying that my parents were illegally parked and had to pay a fine. The fine was only about £14, the equivalent of £14.
So compared with the other experiences that your mum and dad have had, being asked for $3,500 at gunpoint, this feels at this stage fairly minimal.
So they're like, we don't actually believe they're police, but we'll pay the fine. And when we go in the morning to the town to get the lights fixed, we'll go to the police station and we'll report that maybe it's a local gang or something operating on this road for the police to be aware. So they paid the fine. The lads gave them a sort of receipt, a ticket, and off they went. Mum and Dad just went back to bed.
Back to sleep. And that's, and I can imagine in lots of other trips, if that kind of thing had happened, that would have been it. Mum and Dad go back to sleep. They wake up in the morning. They go in. They go into the town and carry on with the things they've been doing every year, really for decades. They've been doing this. But that night it was different, and these young men came back.
Yeah, I guess they'd got greedy. They'd seen in. It was still early in the trip. It would have been a packed camper van, and so they bashed on the door again. And my dad at that point had enough, so climbed into the cab of the camper van to drive off. But the lads had come back armed, and so as Dad tried to drive, one of them had an iron bar, and he smashed through the driver's window and kept beating my dad until he died. They then fled the scene again a second time, and Mum tried to resuscitate my dad but couldn't. She couldn't move the vehicle because my dad was a dead weight in the seat. There's nowhere to go. It was a empty road, and so she just then got dressed and hid valuables like her passport and wedding ring and the ticket they'd given, and most of the money they had to give away, and then planted a little bit of money by the door because she thought they're going to come back, but there's nothing I can do. And she just read her Bible and prayed, and sure enough, the lads did come back. They had to. My mum had seen them kill my dad, and they needed to clear up the evidence, and so they came back to kill her and steal more. But they didn't succeed.
So they I don't think anyone listening will fail to be moved by that story. And I imagine for you, no matter how many times you talk about it, it's just incredibly sad. And the thought of your mum sitting there, not being able to move your dad and waiting. So as you said, they did come back to try and finish up what they'd started, so there wouldn't be witnesses. They attacked your mum. Mercifully, she wasn't killed. Was taken to a hospital. When she was found, was taken to a hospital. You and your siblings are unaware of this back in the UK, and then someone gets in touch to tell you what's happened. Just tell us what happened between hearing and you getting out to Hungary.
Yeah, so it was broken on Sky News actually before any of us knew. Fortunately,
did you hear it on the news first of all? No.
So my sister was the first one to be told. She was told in work. My brother was in the family home. He was awoken by the Daily Mail ringing. But actually, as they started to speak to him about things, the doorbell went and it was police. So again, he had the news broken to him the right way. But neither of them knew where I was. So it took a bit longer for me to be tracked down. I was running children's camps down in Kent. So it took a few more hours for me to be located. And then I got called up and told by a policeman. It's probably one of the most surreal moments in my life, really. And because it's where he was telling me about what had happened to Mum. And he didn't mention my dad at all. And so in my head, the cogs were whirring going, Dad must be dead. Because you'd begin with the good news otherwise. You'd begin with, your dad's okay, but your mum's in intensive care. But he didn't. But I felt like I was almost floating above the room watching on. I get shock. So I was told. And then my brother and sister flew down from West Yorkshire to Heathrow. And I was driven across to Heathrow. And we met there and flew out that night. So I think my dad was killed on a sort of Monday night, but we didn't find out till the Wednesday, and we arrived Wednesday night in Hungary, met by this British consul, but it was too late to go to be with my mum. So we went over on the Thursday to see my mum. Yeah,
and so you've chatted a bit about this. You meet your mum in the hospital. I guess we might imagine what meeting her is like. But your reaction when you see her?
Oh, it was awful. Like, I've never seen anyone looking like her. I knew it was my mum, but she was almost unrecognizable for state she was in. And her voice didn't even sound right because her jaw had been smashed and she hadn't yet been operated on. So it didn't sound like her. It didn't look like her. But as we walked in, she was actually doing an interview live with Yorkshire Television, the news, talking about, well, I think they'd phoned up to see how she was.
So they got there ahead of you, or got in touch ahead of you even being there. Okay, and she's
it was
interviewed.
It was more of a newspaper because it was so delayed in them finding us.
Yeah, of course.
So even when we flew out, it was in the London Evening Standard front page as we climbed onto the plane and got our complimentary copy. So the press were almost one step ahead all the time. So she was just talking. There was only one doctor in the hospital who spoke English. He wasn't on duty. So when they'd phoned, they just handed the phone to my mum, and she was talking through the events of the night. And sorry, as we walked in, they just had told us they'd just caught the lads because the ticket they'd given to them was actually one of their speeding tickets. So my mum had been able to point out where that was. She didn't know it was a speeding ticket. She just gave it, said where it was as evidence. So I kind of walked in knowing they'd been caught. I didn't know much about them. I knew their age and the three of them. And then saw her and listened to a voice that didn't sound like her describing the most horrendous things happening to her and my dad. And so I think it was hatred that I experienced. I don't think until that point the penny had probably dropped. But at that moment, just rage was pumping through me. Like, my dad was really gentle. And mum and dad had obviously lived quite sacrificially. And to hear of a brutal murder, really, and what my mum had to see before her, I was so angry. If they'd been put in front of me, the guys at that moment, I think I probably would have tried to kill them myself. That's how I felt. You know, like we said, I actually did hate in that moment. But then mum, right at the end of the interview, just said to the TV presenter, I don't bear any malice. In fact, I forgive them. And if there are any Christians, so speaking to the viewers, if there's any Christians watching, can you pray they don't just know my forgiveness, but they also know God's forgiveness? At which point my sort of emotional levels erupted and I ran out because I was just like, how can she do that?
Let me ask something else here, because that's, I mean, in some ways that goes back to the beginning, because what your mum's not saying there, and I'm going to ask just a couple of more questions about your mum's reaction and her responses. I guess by saying she's not saying it doesn't matter. She's saying she's not going to bear malice. She wants to forgive them and praying that they get God's forgiveness. That's because for your mum, there's someone else involved in this as well. But that wasn't, for your mum, that wasn't just a one-off reaction. It wasn't coming around from anesthesia.
She said that. So when we came back to the UK, we had press conferences and all sorts. People just couldn't believe this woman could say this, having witnessed what she had and being left for dead herself. But she, it was true for her. With God's help, she had forgiven them. And so even to the point that when she went to the trial, which was 6 months later, she was able to look each of them in the eye and told them she forgave them and gave each of them a Bible and a care package for prison. So, I don't know, stationery and sweets and toiletries, things like that, and asked to keep in touch with them. She wanted to know who they were. And,
I think many people probably find that staggering to you. You know, for those of us growing up watching Hollywood films, when the bad guys get caught, the way the film ends is not with the victim providing a care package for them to be sent into prison with, but just so your mum makes up things to make their time in prison, I guess, or certainly their entrance into prison easier, even as they've been rightly found guilty and sent to prison. And she has to keep in touch with them. Did they agree to that?
So one didn't, but the other two did. So she went back and, well, she wrote to them on and off. And then on the first anniversary, she went back because the mayor of the town had put up a memorial to my dad, sort of acknowledging all he had done, my parents had done for Hungary, but also the wider area. And so she went back and saw them then. And then I think saw two of them. And then she went back another time with Channel 4 dispatchers and met with just one of them at that point.
Oh, met with one of them.
Yeah, so she saw them visited them in prison twice. One of them in prison twice and one once.
And do you know what impact that had on them?
Yeah, so as I say, two of them wrote. One more consistently. Actually, the one who wrote was Istvan. Istvan was the one who beat Dad to death. He was 18. It was quite sobering. He was only 8 days younger than my little brother, my younger brother. And so I think for us, that was quite, wow, like so similar in age, such a different path. So Istvan had killed Dad and got the longest prison sentence. But a few years later, after that, he wrote one of his letters to my mum was titled, "I caused death, but through it I found life." And he talked about how he couldn't get over how this lady could forgive him for all he had done to her and her family. But he knew that she kept pointing to a God who forgives. And so he had decided to read the Bible she'd given him. And as she read the Bible, he came to see that he believed that the claims of Jesus were true, that Jesus had lived a perfect life and done amazing things, but more than that, had died and come back to life after 3 days so that our punishment from God could be taken. And so he had come to ask God to forgive him.
Yeah, and Tamar, the question I was going to ask, I think you've partly answered there. I'm slightly asking you to answer on behalf of your mum, who's not here to answer, but I was going to say, how would your mum would have justified her reaction? It is, not just being content with justice, not just being, content that the men who've done this have been caught and there's just punishment, and justice is a right thing.
Yeah.
Is that partly how, I think from what you were saying, is that how she would have, in your mind, justified saying, well, not just saying she would do, but feeling compelled to forgive? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's right. I think all of us felt it right that they were punished. Like you say, justice is, it does matter. It matters to us. It matters to God. It was right that we were punished and received the sentences they did. But yeah, I think having herself experienced God's love and kindness and forgiveness to herself, she wanted to demonstrate that to them, and wanted to know, not just from her, but from God himself. And funny, earlier today I was at church and we were looking at a bit where in the book of John, where it talks about, Jesus says, "Whoever comes to me, I will not drive away." And I think Mum wanted to know that even though they had done wrong, God didn't drive them away, and she didn't want to drive them away either.
Okay. Tamar, thank you for telling us that. And just to say to people again, there's a few questions coming through. If there's other questions that are coming to mind, do pop them up. We will. I've done as I expected. I've chatted to you a bit longer than I said I would, Tamar, but I've got one other kind of question before we have a pause, and then we'll have a little bit of time for some of these questions. You mentioned your reaction of hatred. As we're listening to you now, even mentioning the name of the man who killed your dad, you're not sounding like someone who's continued with that hatred. Tell us about your reaction, because I think there's been a change there as well.
Yeah, so as I heard my mum say it, I was so angry, and I stormed out onto the hospital balcony and just stood there and raging, really. You know, when you grip something so tightly, your knuckles change colour. I was holding the railing, and I guess ask questions that we all ask at different times in life, sort of, you know, how can God do this? Well, firstly, I think, is God actually real? So all this, I was 20 at the time, 20 years of belief. Is this real? And even in that moment, I could look back and go, yeah, I believe that God is real, because I've seen him at work through my own hostage, or so various incidents in my own life. I believe he's real because I can see it through history. I've seen it in other people's life. So I kind of answered it in different ways. I was like, but do I believe he's good? Because it's one thing to say God exists, but another thing to go, well, I believe he's good. And again, I was able to sort of think through evidence in my head from my own life, other people's life, through history. That made me go, well, yeah, I do. And then do I believe he sent Jesus to earth? I was studying history at the time, and I knew there's loads of historical evidence that Jesus is a real historical figure, and had lived and died. And then so went through big questions like that and got to, well, do I believe I'm meant to forgive? Yeah,
and this is out on the balcony.
Out on the balcony.
This is all churning away all your experience from the years. It comes, in some ways, it comes down to a moment out in the balcony, just trying to process this.
Do I believe this? Do I believe this? What do I do with this? And I can remember just inwardly talking to God and just going, I know I should forgive. I know I should be like Mum, but I can't do it. I just can't. Like, there's no way I can flip a switch and go from hatred to love, from anger to forgiveness, from rage to peace. I just can't do it. I can almost go like, God, I know you've shown me incredible kindness, but I'm not you. I can't do this. I can't manifest this emotion up. If you want me to forgive, I need you to work in me and change me. And it was almost kind of like holding it out, you know, so these are my emotions, please do something. And God did. He enabled me. Now, forgiveness isn't always that. Often it's a sort of going back, and I think actually that even within this situation, there's been times where I've gone, do I mean this? Am I going to continue, you know, that choosing not to hold on or not to mull over, to wish bad? But it was an instant sort of calmness or peace that swept over me. And so I was able to go back within the hour and talk with my mum and say, I'm with you in this. I forgive them. I forgive them too. Now, as I said at the beginning, when I define forgiveness, that doesn't take the pain away. Of course it doesn't. You know, I lost my dad that day, and in many ways I lost my mum. And so it doesn't stop that sorrow and heartache. But yeah, it definitely took away the hatred and the anger.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think listening to you and the story of your mum, it sounds like you're saying, I think Christian faith both, I think really helpfully explaining about your mum, it gives both the grounds for forgiveness. Here's a reason why we should forgive. And your mum explaining that, here's what God's done for me. If he's done this, that I need to forgive. But that's helpful to hear. You could kind of know that, and it's still the emotion inside. It doesn't just flick a switch immediately. But again, it sounds like what you're explaining from your situation. Christian faith both gives the grounds for forgiveness, and strangely, in your experience, a kind of power for forgiveness as well. Here was if you like the miracle on that bus you talked to us about earlier. Here's another miracle on a balcony where you were changed. Thank you for explaining that. And that's helpful to hear as well. It doesn't mean everything is totally sorted out in your head for everything, and every emotion is then sort of flattened down and it's all okay. There's things that still go on. I guess we're going to have some questions in a moment, and maybe I'll come back to this. For someone who's there might be someone who's watching who's been hurt, and I'll leave you to think about this for a moment, and we'll come back to it with some other questions. But someone who's watching who's been hurt and feeling they really would like to forgive, and what do we do with that? And issues are complicated. You think about where you encourage them to start, and also I guess there might be someone who's watching who thinks like this young man, and might, hopefully not to the same extent, but might be thinking, I've done something that I do continue to feel wretched about, and what can I possibly do about that? We're going to pause just for a moment. Tamar, I think Ben, who's working behind the scenes, is going to pop you off for a moment. Tamar will be back in a moment. Thank you for the questions that you've been sending in. If I look up at the moment, it's just I've got them up on another screen, and we're going to come to some of those for the last little bit of time. Before we do that, we're just giving Tamar just a little breather there, but we wanted to mention a couple of other things that you might be interested in. You might be someone who's watching, and the reason you've joined in tonight is because you've been to some of the others. Christian faith is something that you're beginning to think about. You want to know, it's intriguing. You want to find out a bit more about it. You've got some questions to ask. Maybe it's a friend who's invited you along, and there's, they're a Christian, and again, you've got questions to ask. We've got something starting a week on Monday, not tomorrow night, but a week on from Monday, called Christianity Explored. There's a little wheel spinning there. There might be something popping up on the screen. There it is. I got big questions about live Christianity Explored. It's a series of evenings, Monday evenings. We're going to be meeting online with all the restrictions we've got at the moment, but it's a chance to look at a bit of the Bible together and Mark's account of Jesus's life. So there'll be time to hear a bit of that, listen to a very short talk, explaining something of this, and then time for questions, time to discuss, ask your questions, or listen in as other people do that. There's already people who are wanting to come along to that. You won't be on your own. Many people have found it helpful. It doesn't commit you to anything. But if you're thinking, do you know what, I want to find out a little bit more about this, Christianity Explored could be a really helpful thing for you. So that's one thing to mention. Another thing is good to do is come along to Christchurch on a Sunday. We have our Sunday services, 3 in the morning at the moment, that are in person, 9 o'clock, 10:15, 11:30, and then there's one in early evening, 5 o'clock. They're about 50 minutes long, with the kind of restrictions in place. We're also live streaming the 10:15 service. You could tune into those or come along in person. You can email if you'd like to let us know you're coming, if you want to do that, and hear a bit more about what the Bible says about God and about people, and think a little bit more. So that could be something you'd be really welcome any Sunday to join us. And the last thing to say is, maybe you have been tuning in on Sundays and you'd like to kind of, if you like, pop your head up and say, I'm here. Hello, I'd like to get to know some people at Christchurch. Well, on our website, there's a little thing to say to let us know you've been watching and you're new, and we can give you some more information about other things that are coming on. So that's 3 things. Yeah, Christianity Explored, coming along on Sundays, letting us know maybe you've been watching online. You can do that. I'm going to get Tamar to come back now. She's going to come back on. Tamar, we've got a few questions. Thank you very much for being willing to take these questions, and we'll see how we go. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. But here's one. I can imagine. I'm not surprised that people have asked this question. We're looking at you now as a grown woman, but we're also hearing a story of an 8-year-old being, traveling around. Going back to that, do you resent the choices your parents made?
No, no. In fact, quite the opposite. I'm really glad of them. I think that change really started coming in when I was about 13, which was when the Iron Curtain fell, but also probably just grown a bit of maturity, and then just realizing actually what my parents were doing had so much more value than just going on a package holiday all the time. And so I began to appreciate the way that they lived out their faith and were making a difference to people's lives. So that was as a teenager. Even I probably was still grumpy because as a teenager, but now again I just think I think it's given me a better understanding of different cultures. I think it's given me a real grounding, as I've said before, to my faith, and a real desire to share what I've experienced and know to be true with others. And I think often, I mean, it's the same in loads of areas of parenting, isn't it? I work with families, and we talk about often with parenting, it's easy to go for short-term gain. Or I'll just give them a sweet, I'll just let them watch your telly, but it can lead to long-term pain. I think what my parents did with us was the reverse. They went through long-term pain, 6 weeks every summer, taking us to Eastern Europe. But actually, short-term pain that way, but it has long-term gain. So we often go for the short gain, but it has long pain, and they reversed it. And so I think the gains I have is brilliant.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Two questions about your mum, and just to say that obviously your dad died in that evening. Your mum died a little while ago as well. There's a question somebody asked. Look, after all that experience, did your mum return to Eastern Europe? You know, she was doing all these trips. Did she carry on with those?
Yeah, she did. She went back several times over in groups. My mum, about 18 months after my dad was killed, my mum started experiencing post-traumatic stress and had quite horrific flashbacks, but that didn't stop her. However, at about 18 months after that, or it's hard to know when, that changed, and she had the early onset Alzheimer's. So just 3 years after Dad died, she was diagnosed with that. And soon after that, she still did a trip or two, but really, those of us who've had relatives with Alzheimer's know how difficult that can be to manage. And so her trips did stop within a year or so of the diagnosis. I've been back a couple of times since. In fact, I went back for the 20th anniversary a couple of years ago.
Okay, and but that, so in some ways you can listen to the story and hope that for your mum it was all just in some ways a happy ending now, but life would continue to be hard, and sounds like she continued to make choices, not just about what was easy, but what she thought was right, Christian wise. Can I? I think this is it can be a tricky question to think through, but I shouldn't set it up like that, should I? That just makes you nervous before I've asked it. But obviously we talked about something that was very difficult, but if there's somebody who's done something and who doesn't feel any remorse, and we talk about forgiveness in that context, does that make sense? What, in some ways, every offer of forgiveness carries an accusation of guilt. It's saying to someone, I want to forgive you, but you've done something wrong. So you mentioned what actually, I don't think you did say this, but you see the question. What do you do with someone who doesn't show remorse as a Christian?
Yeah, I think how I've worked it through is with other situations, because obviously I have experienced issues where I've been hurt and let down before and since that day. I think for me, I've come to go, do you know, I am responsible for my reaction, my response. So often I've struggled to forgive far pettier things because I've wanted to hold on to it, and I've wanted to be vindicated. I've wanted people to know what this other person has done, and I've kept on going back to it, and I've really struggled. But then going, actually taking myself back to what undeserved kindness has God shown to me, Okay, and how has God enabled me? Right, how I respond. And actually those perpetrators, those people who failed me, they are going to be before God one day and accountable for their actions, and I am leaving it to him to sort of, work on them and their hearts. I need to work on my own with his help.
Yeah, no, that's helpful, because that's saying, isn't it? It's if you're persuaded of that, and as a Christian you are, if you're persuaded of that is the opposite of saying it doesn't matter and these things are swept away. Because I can imagine people, what feels hard, isn't it, is the injustice of it. It's the thought that somebody's got away with it. And there's plenty of cases, isn't there, where people do seem to get away with it. But in a sense, I guess what you're saying, that's one of the liberating things of Christian faith, because it can sound quite alarming at times, but it's saying nobody gets away with anything. People is that right? Is that part of what's helpful and liberating for that one day people will have to stand before God? Either, I guess that's why your mum's saying, let's pray that they find forgiveness in Jesus.
Yeah.
Sorry, that wasn't a very good question there, was it? I didn't actually land to the question. You were just helping me think it through, which is not what people are tuning in to watch, is it? So I need to get better at these questions. That was helpful for me. Thank you very much, Tamar. Thank you. You've helped me with my thinking there. Let me ask you another question, so I can move on from that. Is there you've sort of been talking about God helping you, but is one of the questions that's been asked is, does this kind of forgiveness generally feel like it gets tested, it gets strained? Is there parts of the Bible that help you? Has there been particular parts of the Bible as well that help you think it through and just keep clear in your mind what's right?
Yeah, so I think, for example, 6 months after Dad died, I think that's really when my grief kicked in. I can remember walking around the university campus. It was a day that sort of a trigger for it kicking in was a friend of mine in his 20s died of a brain tumor. And I was just heartbroken and angry that someone who had only been married 18 months had been taken, and walking around the university campus just broken. When you're not just a tear rolling, but that sort of belly ache, sobbing, uncontrollable. And I think, again, that's going back to what do I know to be true in those moments. So it's not trying to suppress the emotion. I think actually with my grief, a lot of the time I did, because I didn't know how to deal with it. I think it's being real about how we feel. We've got a God who longs for us to talk about how we feel, who understands our pain, but also knowing what's true. There's a bit in, I think the verse that helps me most is from an early book in the Bible, in Deuteronomy 29 verse 29, and it talks about the secret things that God has that we'll never get, and we can't get. We're not God. And so there are things I don't understand. I'll never understand why Mum had Alzheimer's. I can, it's a cruel and horrific disease. There are secret things, but it talks about what God has revealed, enable us to continue. And so I think I go, well, I know that God has proven himself time and again to be good and faithful and kind and powerful. I know that he gets my heartache. So he doesn't just want to hear it, but he gets it, because Jesus was, when he lived on earth, was battered and rejected and let down. So he gets a heartache. He longs to help me. He doesn't just hear it and gets it, but he longs to comfort me and help me. And he promises one day every tear will be wiped away and death will be gone. And I think so it's going back to those truths in those times. Yes, of course it's been tested. Life hurts, doesn't it? That all of us situations experience brokenness and pain, and And so I think it's going back to what has been revealed and how does that help me keep continuing. Does that answer?
Yeah, no, it does. And what you're saying, the heart of Christian faith is like the person of Jesus who has experienced being battered and bruised and killed and done that so that you and I both believe what the Bible says to be true, so that justice will be upheld.
Yeah.
And also so that forgiveness is available, but in a just way. So that's thank you. Just very briefly, and these would be much bigger questions, but the kind of starting points, and we'll finish with this because you've given us such a good amount of time. But for someone who's either feeling, I feel hurt, and I'd like to find the ability to be able to forgive. The issues might be complicated. Where might you encourage them to start?
I guess I'd encourage them to start by, firstly, by chatting to someone if they can. So the person who sent them a link for tonight, the friend in Christchurch who they know, speak with someone. Maybe do the Christianity Explored course that's been mentioned and just investigate. Because I think, like we say, I think I'm nothing special. And my parents, although they did extraordinary things, they were pretty ordinary people. And the only reason they did what they did and Mum and I were able to respond as we responded is because of what we discovered to be true about Jesus. So I'd say, speak up. Some of those hurts take a long time to walk through. So don't feel like you have to do it on your own, but do investigate the one who knows you better than anyone else. And gets you the heartaches the most.
Okay, and similarly for the person who's maybe watching and feeling, and maybe they've never admitted it to anyone, I've done something really wretched and I feel beyond the pale. Is there anything you would say, given that you are someone who's forgiven people who've done that? Where would be a good place for them to start?
Again, it feels like a little kid just going through the same answer again, but I think it is Jesus. Those words I mentioned from John earlier, he says, whoever comes to me, I will never drive you away. God loves to extend those arms of forgiveness to us, and Jesus has paid the price for the deepest, most horrific acts, that whether people know them or not. He loves us to come to him. He'll never drive us away. So again, find out more, chat to the person who invited you, investigate, talk to God.
Tamar, thank you very much. You've given us a great amount of time and shared all sorts of things with us. On behalf of everyone who's watching, let me on their behalf, I'm sure they'd want me to say thank you. Thank you very much for the time, for telling us about your mum and dad and your family and those experiences as well. Thank you. I hope you have a good rest of the evening. I know you're going on to another kind of youth meeting thing from your church. So thank you for taking time out for this. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye for now. And thanks very much to you if you've been tuning in with us tonight. I hope you've enjoyed that. It's going to be on YouTube as well. You can watch it again. You can pass it on to other people. We do these events from time to time. There isn't another one booked in yet, but I'm sure it won't be long before there's another Tackling Life coming up. So look out for that. And if we didn't get to your questions, I'm really sorry about that. We didn't have time to do everything. But if a friend has invited you along or asked you to tune in for this, why not ask them? See what they think of it. And do think about that Christianity Explored series of evenings that we're going to be running. If you're free and able to join us, you can email into the church office or the events page on our church website. That would be a great thing to come along to. But thank you very much for joining us tonight. Let me say goodbye